Okay, so so the topic today is how sustainability and well-being kind of interrelate. Just to remind everyone, but by the way, thank you very much for coming. It's always very precious to us to have you share your time with us and make these discussions rich. So just to remind that what defines our group a little bit is this idea of well-being budgeting. So we try to at least have that in the back of the mind or the forefront in focusing our discussion. So indulge me for a moment with a slightly frivolous start. I want to talk about a set of low probability events which are thought to pose existential risks to civilization. Well, I'm not going to talk about them, but I'm going to mention some. In fact, so here are a list of the main ones. Right, so there's an asteroid impact. We know these can be devastating. It happened 65 million years ago. For some reason, people still think that the chance of a nuclear apocalypse is very high. I mean, in historical terms. Pandemics could get even worse. You know, in some senses, you could say that COVID has been mostly harmless to some. There are, of course, also intentional biological weapons that could happen. People are already putting resources seriously to thinking about how to mitigate mistakes with artificial intelligence. There are reasons for people to actually calculate real probabilities of this. There's something called the gray goo scenario, which people are thinking about in terms of nanotechnology. This is gamma ray bursts are thought possibly to be a cause of the second largest mass extinction on the Earth, 440 million years ago. This kind of mega volcanic activity in scenarios could take out a couple billion people or some billions of people in short order. And so all of those are mostly have scenarios which actually involve what are called extinction events, but just in terms of sort of apocalyptic outcomes, there are other reasons why people think institutions could collapse suddenly. Our food systems, you know, imagine if cyber attacks or a series of rapid climate change events that kind of compound each other could actually bring things down and cause a total collapse in which most people end up dying for lots of horrible reasons. So there are actually serious people who work on thinking about these probabilities, and they come up with think about the probabilities of each of them, and if you add them all up, you find out that the chance of one of us dying in a human extinction event is 5 times the chance of one of us dying in a car accident. Okay, and of course, road traffic accidents are a major leading global cause of death, especially for young people, although largely in developing countries. Anyway, the point is, or a point is, think seriously for a moment. How much should your department, your agency, be spending on these? How many, or as a society, how much of our human resources should we be spending on preparing for or preventing these risks? And my point here is not to say that we should be doing more or less for dealing with these things. My point is instead that some things with enormous impact and let's say considerable probability, non-zero probability, can also come bundled with overwhelming uncertainty. So and I've tried to show some risks that are maybe not environmental, right? So some of these societal collapse, like cyber attack, stand for the fact that sustainability, as we're free to discuss it today, doesn't just refer to environmental questions. But the way I'm going to define it is it's the questions which come with a lot of uncertainty and are about relatively far futures. So, okay, so how many resources should we allocate to this kind of stuff? Let's take a more familiar, maybe policy scenario. Let's say that we're choosing how much to spend on each of these items as part of a homeless strategy, or some inequality issue, and we have to essentially choose to allocate resources amongst these items. Or even a slightly more complicated thing, we may have another broad initiative and we have to allocate between different departments or different, quite different areas of spending. Now, if you buy into the premise of a well-being budgeting agenda at all or significantly, like I do, then it means that you think that the science of happiness can help us make better allocation decisions. It can help guide us. It has some usefulness in guiding us to make this kind of decision, as well as to carry out these kind of programs better. Now, what if as well we were allocating between these two things and how much to put into preparation for a mega volcanic event? If we try and do that, we run into trouble. And the reason here really is that although we have a reasonable way to use the statistical inference from life satisfaction research or whatever is the framework to get some useful guidance for some of these things, the uncertainty blows up when we start adding this last one, and it's going to muddy everything, or at least it's going to certainly muddy the allocation between these three big agenda items. And so my main point for a premise for today, for my comments now, is that we could kill the utility of the usefulness of the well-being framework if we ask of it things it cannot do well enough. Let me try to illustrate this idea another time. So yeah, I used to live right under this here and ran out with nothing at all at 1 in the morning some years ago. So in principle, homeowners can look up decent statistics about the risk of a house fire, and we can make decisions about the well-being impacts of carbon monoxide poisoning or risk of death. And we can therefore choose appropriately to invest in good fire escapes, good smoke detectors, and indeed fire insurance. Those risks are actually not that hard to calculate, and they're low though. And maybe the well-being impacts are a little bit difficult for us to at least empathize with, but we have relatively good information for those, but they're harder than other kinds of decisions that we make, arguably. However, society doesn't want us to make the decisions that way. Rather than give people those options, we don't give a choice about smoke detectors or fire escapes or insurance, or subscribing to fire departments through taxes, which used to be optional. So we tell people to take those rules as given and those expenditures as given, and then spend their time and their thinking on optimizing their well-being in other domains where outcomes are easier to predict and these calculations are easier to do. And so maybe some people would be better off with actually having that choice, but they don't complain because it's compartmentalized. It's something that we all now accept as a requirement in principle. So I'm simplifying a little bit the reasons that why we have the fire policies that we do, but the point is that we accept some things as non-negotiable while making other decisions with a framework for optimization. So let's say we're building a quality of life dashboard or a well-being indicator system, and we start putting in things that we think are important to well-being. And I would say this is what I'm demonstrating here is, I think, a mistake, and it's something that you see a lot of times historically at the kind of progress indicators that people start constructing about well-being, and then I think they add in things that maybe shouldn't be there. This list with good things, security of housing, high trust in the workplace, long list as we've discussed before, and then CO2 emissions per capita. So this one, I would say, this is clearly wrong. This doesn't fit, it's different. Why is it different? Well, we don't have good scientific evidence to tell us that higher CO2 emissions per capita, say as an individual or as a country, are good for well-being, in fact, nor that they're bad. Moreover, it's likely listed here for the opposite reason, that somebody designing the dashboard actually thinks this number should be low. So at this point, I would say this is not really a quality of life dashboard. This is becoming a policy agenda. And if we do that, we lose the coherence about the meaning of the thing, and also we lose, as for the reasons I've described already, the guidance about making lives better, right? Because this might be a goal that is laudable, but it's very hard to relate in the way these other things are to making lives better. And if I should spell that out a little bit more, I would say, lives of people who we know, and now and in the with the current generation, or within our lifetimes, within a life cycle or two. So I think this is very important, because I feel, I mean, this is one of the strongest things I'm feeling dealing with about society now in my teaching and some of my research is, why is it that we are so stuck in dealing with some of our big future risks and challenges? And I think partly things like the economy versus the environment dichotomy, which is poisonous. And so I think that not only does putting CO2 emissions per capita in here make this harder to use in the practical sense, but it also makes it something that's not compelling and not optimistic. So I think when we dilute these dashboards too much in their meaning, it can be politically divisive, but it also can represent a debilitating source of cognitive dissonance for, say, the general public. In fact, I would say, maybe it's an interesting property for such dashboards to make sure that we phrase everything in positive ways. So rather than having our metric of homelessness or something, we can make sure to list security of housing and frame things positively, so that when we look at this, it's actually inspiring. Okay, so what about instead having a scenario like this, where we have a quality of life dashboard which doesn't list CO2 emissions per capita, but there's also a policy in which we are hellbound to become carbon consumption neutral by some date. I'm making this up so I get to put in all my dream policies here, but not to get into those details. So now, this is essentially my recommendation. My approach is to try and separate these things out and rely on separate rhetorical principles to promote well-being, make decisions about it, and then to deal with the really difficult, complex, long-term questions. Now, does meeting a carbon neutral goal have implications for well-being? Surely yes. Danny Graham asked me yesterday about a shrinking economy and say the implications for people's retirement funds if we impose constraints that let's say shrink our economy. So I mean, I don't have all the answers here for sure, and we get into a lot of deeper policy issues that go beyond well-being, but some of them do relate to well-being. And so, for instance, we tend to overestimate the importance of pecuniary measures and outcomes, income and so on, for well-being. And my real belief, I mean, my biggest motivation in all of this is really the transformation, so that society is thinking about well-being in a different way, and informed by what we know about it. Right? So a true focus on well-being will dilute the fear around a decreasing GDP. That's one important thing. And then secondly, and I'm becoming more and more kind of a techno-optimist, but is that in fact, you might well expect that economic growth would be very fast if we carried out a transition, or if we invested in kind of almost any imposed limit like this. Innovation is extraordinarily rapid in the modern economy. And so you may well actually believe that if you simply commit to necessary constraints and then optimize well-being within, not only should you not be paying attention to GDP per se to the extent that we do, but in other words, you should be indifferent about what it does, but it's really not obvious what would lead to growth or decrease. Anyway, I guess okay. And of course you see, I mean, you see many countries and firms and investment funds and banks all committing to this kind of cap, this kind of goal. And it's really conceptually divorced from the other things that these institutions are pursuing. And that is the only way I can get my head around how to pursue well-being in a world in which we have these longer-term complex challenges to deal with, is to compartmentalize them when necessary. Okay, so to kind of summarize, I think what the principles I want to get across. And by the way, I mean, I've been thinking about this sustainability and well-being topic for a long time. In 2009, I got together a bunch of elected officials and academics and community leaders and a journalist in a one-day symposium in Vancouver on the same topic of well-being and sustainability. Then, as now, the precise focus being on this new science of happiness and how it relates to our sustainability challenges. And so, but the more I think about this, the more it seems like the point I want to make is partly or largely something about rhetoric and about strategy, political feasibility and strategy, or something else in political science, which is not really my training. So the gist is this, that I think the science of well-being has something to offer for policy in the sense of well-being budgeting, meaning we can describe a framework to use that would be helpful and maybe transformative in advising various government decisions. And so those benefits, as I've probably outlined elsewhere, in particular of using a life satisfaction-oriented well-being framework, are to do with communication, to do with accountability of the objectives, and then to do with the analytic power, which for advising, informing decisions. But my fear is that these benefits can be lost if we dilute the framework with things that it cannot handle. And that's because, number one, it will lose its scientific confidence. So this is, as I mentioned, for long run, unfamiliar, unpredictable, complex, and uncertain dynamics, the kind of investment decisions that one needs to make, in other words, what is the well-being impact in some future date from what I do now, becomes too uncertain, in addition to other problems to do with also accounting or aggregation, like whose well-being are we talking about? Those just simply become very difficult. And so that's kind of a practical fact. My take, for instance, on climate policy over the last 3 decades is that economists basically wasted 2 to 3 decades because we, trying to figure out what some particular parameters were in our discounting functions and our preference functions. And as a result, because we couldn't properly calculate what the social costs of carbon were, it meant we had to carry on doing research in some sense. And I think that was enabled stalling, and was quite complicit in us not doing something. If we had had a different way to work with these things, which was a little bit more precautionary, I suppose, but we thought these are risks which we don't know how to deal with well. Let's not put them in that same optimization framework of figuring out what the marginal returns of this policy are. I think that's the way to deal with the really tough stuff. And another way to put that was, there are things which we should just, in the face of ignorance, we can make sure that certain things don't change too fast, right? And so that can apply to a lot of environmental and ecological measures, but also other stuff in society, which we don't know why this is important. It's okay to change, but let's do it gradually. And then that becomes a constraint on your policy. So the second reason that these benefits can be lost if they're diluted and so on is really the one where is less my expertise, is this kind of rhetorical and political issue, and it's to do with that a framework will lose its spiritual purity, its optimistic focus, and I think also its staying power, its political divisiveness is a lot of the issues that are that we have least information about from our models and from science are also the things where partisan differences maybe matter most in decision making. Okay, and by the way, I'm not the first to advocate separating well-being and sustainability. I mean, this was an important recommendation even from the Fitoussi Sen Stiglitz report, the 2009 Stiglitz report. So, but the more I kind of think about, anyway, so this is, hopefully I'm making, so I have one more way I'd like to simply present the same idea, I think. And so this is a diagram of, from the longer version of the paper that's behind the short brief I sent out. Here, I think, is my current stylized view of how policy is being made now. Not being made, but let's say an idealized view of how policy can be made, right? We have a set of prospective policies. Well, this is a very small part of the policy making process, I can say that. We have prospective policies, and then we have something in mind about what will happen over time if we take a particular course of action. And in fact, our ideas about what will happen over time are informed by maybe simplistic, or in some cases not so simplistic, knowledge about investments, about dynamics, about what happens if we invest a little bit more in children at this age, what happens if we build this piece of infrastructure, what are the benefits that are going to arise over time. We actually have to calculate that crudely or in a sophisticated way in order to communicate the value of our policy. The life satisfaction approach means that once we have already reached this stage where we're predicting objective outcomes in the future, so what is going to be the recidivism rate, what is going to be the homelessness rate, in 5 years or 10 or 20 when we do this thing, we then are actually able to translate those things into a measure of well-being at future times through our knowledge about what is good for people. So this is the contribution of life satisfaction. Just this last part, it doesn't actually change all of this. And then here is my view of how sustainability comes in, right? So there's this list of stuff that we can't deal with well in this paradigm. And maybe the way to do it is to convince people to just accept these big constraints on that we just commit to, more like a rights-based approach or some just a principled approach, ethical, rights-based, whatever, that we compartmentalize mentally, and we're not going to tell you exactly the marginal benefits of these things. We're going to commit them to them because they're the right thing to do. They fit with our values, and so on. Okay, and this policy pre-evaluation picture fits into the larger one, where the left side here is the kind of life satisfaction research side. So, with survey data and so on, and statistical models and so on. This is what I do, and this is the part I know nothing about, and I'm sitting here speculating with you about it. Okay, so summarize, if this is even necessary, life satisfaction has these, in my view, these three benefits as as a central organizing concept for a well-being measurement approach, well-being framework. In principle, policy can be designed to maximize human well-being. I have no fears about technocracy here for the reasons I've articulated elsewhere, but given the uncertainty that we have in our models about the future, plus the questions of distribution of equity, there's always plenty of room for debate and different ideologies here. But I don't think that in any way we can do justice to our needs to respect sustainability, urgent sustainability requirements in such a framework. And so I'm advocating much more something that looks like strong sustainability, looks like precautionary approach in other language, which separates some of these things out in the way I've just explained, where we just say, okay, these things are not going to be negotiable in the same way that we trade off between investment in another nurse and another teacher. Okay, that's it.